The reason we don't see any of the album artwork just yet is pretty simple. We're setting up the cell using a view model. So in album list data source over here, let's go to cell for an index path, and we're using the album cell view model to set this up, but that view model doesn't account for any artwork. At the moment, the cell's image view is simply using the default we specified in Interface Builder. Also, we're not actually calling any method in here, so let's add that really quick. We'll say download artwork for album, and in cell for at index path, we get the album from the data source pertaining to that row, so we'll pass that through with the index path as well. Okay, next let's command click on album cell view model to navigate there, and we'll add a stored property in here for the artwork image. Let artwork of type UI image, and as always, we'll need UIKit for that. To initialize this, we'll query the value of the artwork state property on the album and assign the appropriate image. So we'll say self.artwork equal if album.artwork state equals downloaded, then, now I'm using a ternary operator here, then we'll assign the artwork property from the album, and we know this exists, so we'll force unwrap it, as if I haven't learned my mistake enough already. And then, in the else case, we'll use the album placeholder asset that we added to the assets folder, that default image. Okay, now we'll also need to update the configure model on the album cell. So if we go to views and go to album cell, you'll notice inside this configure method in here is where we're assigning all the values over from the view model. And we'll need to update it to configure the album cell, or rather the artwork view, to accept that image over. So we'll say artwork view.image equal view model.artwork. So let's test this out. If you run this now, we'll search iTunes, we'll start typing the artist's name, we'll tap on it, and we crash. There we go. If you inspect the console log closely, you'll see an error domain in here. So at the bottom, it says error domain, NSCoco error domain code 256. If you look up this code, you'll see it described as a file read unknown error. This is somewhat misleading. The error is because we can't access the resource properly, but it's not because our code is wrong. Starting in iOS 9, Apple added a new security feature called App Transport Security, or ATS, that is enabled by default. ATS improves the privacy and data integrity of connections between an app and web services by enforcing additional security requirements for HTTP-based networking requests, which is what we're doing. Specifically, with ATS enabled, HTTP connections must use HTTPS, the secure version of the protocol. More importantly, you cannot arbitrarily download files from servers without correct security practices. What does this mean for us? This means that if you use a URL that connects over HTTP versus HTTPS, there's a high chance that iOS will block that connection. It forces you to use the secure protocol by default, which is really good for your end users because it prevents their data from being compromised over insecure wireless connections. If you examine our URL string here, which is both inside of this console dump, and for me it's over here as well on the left side, you'll see that it uses HTTP rather than HTTPS, and this is why we're failing. So how do we solve this? Well, in the info.plist file of the project, so if I close all of these, you'll see an info.plist at the bottom, and in here we can customize the settings for ATS to work with our various API providers. So to modify the settings, we're going to click on the plus button, and on this new value that comes up, we're adding a new key here. We're going to say App Transport Security Settings, and hit enter. So you'll see that the value here is a dictionary. So for this key for App Transport Security Settings, we need to add a nested dictionary as a value. Now, the easiest approach to this, which is most oftentimes the wrong one, and it is in this case, is to bypass App Transport Security altogether. So if we click on this plus to add a key value pair to this nested dictionary, we can say allow arbitrary loads, and this takes a Boolean value, and we can say yes. This, however, is wrong simply because it avoids best practices and makes your apps unsafe. Instead, we're going to add an exception on a domain level. So to do that, we're going to use this key, exception domains. Now this key accepts as a value another nested dictionary, and so we'll click plus to add the key. And for the key value pair, we'll specify the domain we want to exclude. So the domain is the key, and here we're going to list, let me make sure this is actually not the right one. Let me get rid of it. Click down here to expand this key value pair, and then click plus to add the new value or the new key. And here the domain is mzstatic.com. For the value, we're going to add another nested dictionary. So here, change the value type as dictionary. And then expand this down and click plus to add more key value pairs. Now, the dictionary we're adding to this as a value for the domain name is information about how we want to treat this exception domain. So if you still have the console up, you'll notice here that I've specified mzstatic as the domain, but the asset is actually stored on is2.mzstatic.com/stuff. So what this means is that our asset is located at a subdomain. So for the domain as the key, we're going to add as a value a dictionary that talks about or that specifies how we want to treat this domain. And so the first thing we're going to put in here in this final nested dictionary, we'll add a key that says ns includes subdomains. And the value is going to be a Boolean, and we're going to say yes. So this means that we want subdomains of this domain included in the exception list. Now the second key value pair is ns exception allows insecure HTTP loads. So ns exception allows insecure HTTP loads. Again, a Boolean value, and again, yes. So what we're saying here is on this domain and any of its subdomains, we do want to allow downloading assets from an HTTP request, so not the secure one. ATS is very important to understand, particularly if you're trying to connect to an API and have no idea why you're failing. So here what we've done is we've said, hey, for this app, we want to add a domain that even though we know it's an HTTP connection and not a secure one, we want to go ahead and get, assets from it, download stuff from it. So we're going to add an exception domain, and we do that as nested dictionaries. And in this final dictionary for the domain, we're saying we want also to include our subdomains and allow those downloads. So now if we finally run the app, search iTunes, Taylor Swift, and look at that. Everything works. And with that, we're done with our app.